Are you a creator thinking of starting a blog or a podcast? Well, we've just launched Podcasters Emporium, our very own online store for podcasters and creators. We've got mics, headphones, audio interfaces, and much more. And to kick everything off, we're offering 25% off everything with the discount code CHATTER. That's all caps CHATTER for 25% off anything at Podcasters Emporium. You'll find the link in the description below. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist with me, Josh Hamilton. Sam McBride, the political editor of the newsletter and author of the book Burned, was our guest in today's show. Burned tells the story of Northern Ireland's Cash for Ash Renewable Heating Incentive scandal. It's a really fantastic piece of journalism that can really help you understand some of the major issues within the Northern Irish government and the way in which numerous civil servants and senior politicians walked almost blindly into a disaster that could cost the taxpayers hundreds of millions of pounds. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, BREXIT, the Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. So here's Sam McBride. So, Sam, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. You may be like the most, I don't know about controversial, but like famous, maybe, political person that I've had on from Northern Ireland. You could maybe say Marcin O'Meara could top you, but like aside from that, I think you're top of the list. So it's a pleasure.
I'm not sure how to react to that, but thanks very much, I guess.
That's fair. So yeah, like let's just jump straight into it. I'd love to like get you to just give like a brief overview of who you are and your career to date, just to give like people who aren't familiar with your work like a chance to understand where you're coming from.
I'm the political editor of the Belfast newsletter, which is the oldest continuously published English language daily newspaper in the world now. It started in 1737, and I've been there for just over 10 years. I started my career at the Belfast Telegraph. I had a brief stint with what was then the East Belfast Community Telegraph, which was printed by the Belfast Telegraph at that point. And I came to the newsletter after that. I'm talking to you, I think, today a lot about my book, which is Burned, which is the inside story of the RHI scandal, which brought down Stormont about 3.5 years ago. And really that, I suppose, has dominated my life, both in terms of the book and in terms of my reporting on that subject for the newspaper for over 3 years, for about 3.5 years now, and is really like nothing else that I've written about, and I could never have imagined when I started writing about it that I would still be talking about it after such a long period of time, and I hope that in 3 years' time I'm still not talking about it, but I'm not sure that will actually be true.
Well, I guess we'll see. Like politics can move very quickly and things can get sort of brushed over that could have blown up, and things blow up that may have been brushed over in a different time period. So we'll really see. But just to say, like Burned is fantastic. Like it's just an amazing piece of journalism. Like the whole way through, I was reading it just being like, wow. Complete respect for the amount of work it must have taken to like build that story from the mountains of evidence that I've no doubt you had to trawl through. What would you say was the most challenging part for you of writing the book?
Well, thanks for your kind words about it. Because one of the unsettling things, I suppose, I've never written a book before. I write very short pieces, relatively speaking, up to about 1,500 words for the newspaper, and you get immediate feedback on that, good or bad. It might even be so bad that it's a legal threat from somebody saying that they're going to sue you for it, but you're pretty clear as to where you sit with it. Writing a book is so completely different. You are stuck for months on end, writing away. Nobody sees your work other than my wife, who would have sort of read the chapters one by one and given me some sort of feedback on it. And her typical response at the end of each chapter was, "Yeah, it's very detailed." and I'm not sure that that was intended as a compliment. So you're never quite sure how people are going to react to it, because it is very detailed. Lots of the people in the book, people have never heard of them before. They're relatively obscure and uninteresting to many people, civil servants, and so therefore, why should anybody care about this? Is, I suppose, the fear that you have as the author, and so therefore, it's, you know, massively gratifying and genuinely surprising to see that so many people actually say they enjoyed it. That yes, it was detailed, but they actually thought it was interesting. But I suppose at the heart of that that challenge as an author is the tension between making it interesting, and that is about chopping out the bits that are boring, the bits that aren't interesting, the bits that take you off into meandering routes which actually are not that central to the story, and yet being true to the actual story. And at the heart of this story is a mystery as to what actually happened and why it happened and why people acted in the ways that they did. And are there benign explanations for that, or do there have to be darker explanations for that? But for me to actually tell the truth honestly there requires me to put in a lot of material which leaves it open to the reader to form their own views about some of those things, not for me to simply say, as the author, I believe this is unimportant. This didn't happen. There is no benign explanation for this, or there is no darker explanation for this. I am telling you what to think. That's simpler. It's a shorter book. It's more readable. It's more compelling, but I think it's less honest. And so that was the constant tension. And yet, if you go to the other extreme and you include everything, you've got a million words. It's unreadable. Nobody's going to read it at all. And so therefore, that's not in the public interest either. So that was the most difficult aspect of this.
I can certainly sympathize with that. There's definitely a tension and a line you have to walk when you're trying to write a detailed book and really get people to understand like an event or series of events in a wider context, where you have to both be detailed enough to give them a realistic and honest account of what went on without just going down so many rabbit holes that you've no idea like where you started. Was there a reason that you felt you needed to write the book? Like, was there a particular moment where you went, okay, I have to write this book? Like, that's something that really like galvanized you to do it? Or was it sort of a thing that kind of gradually evolved out of your reporting into something that you were like, okay, well, it makes sense to put this in a long form piece now?
I never had any ambition to write a book. Lots of journalists, because what we do is writing every day, lots of journalists do have the ambition that they will one day write a book or several books. I never really had that ambition. I'm not sure that I really would have had the stamina or the discipline to stick with a book for that length of time. And so therefore, this was not something that at any point in the early months of this certainly ever really crossed my mind. There were two things that changed my mind. First of all, after having written about it for a couple of years and realized how significant this story was, I mean, it had brought down government in Northern Ireland. It had kept government down in many ways at that point for 2 years. It had exposed a swathe of the machinery of government in Northern Ireland as had never happened in the history of the state. And yet there wasn't a book on this, and there were books on all sorts of other things. So I began to think this is important, and someone needs to write the book. And if someone else writes the book now, that I feel that I've really written more about this than anyone else in Northern Ireland, I'll be pretty annoyed, because I'll think, well, hang on a minute, they've missed this, they've missed that. I knew this, I could have written that. And so I got to that point. And then the second element of it was that people were coming up to me and saying either you should write the book or how's the book going, and just assuming that I was writing it. And I was being asked about it on the radio. I mean, Frank Mitchell, I remember a couple of times on his program where I was on to talk about RHI, asked me if I was writing a book. And the first time I sort of fobbed him off with a joke about, I'll have to talk to my wife about that. And then the second time, I think I had just admitted to him that by that stage I was writing about it. But I had never, ever in my career had anyone, not even one person, suggest to me that I should write a book about anything. And suddenly I had about 20 people saying to me, are you writing a book? So I suddenly thought, well, hang on a minute, there is an interest in this. So it's not just that I think it's important, there actually is potentially a market for this. So yeah, it was those two things that drove me towards it.
Did you have any help in the research? Was it like, did you have some help from people
No.
at the newsletter? It was like completely your own thing. Like, how did you manage to find like a balance there between working for and reporting for the newsletter and working as their political editor at the same time as writing something that's so detailed and in depth?
It was very difficult, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else, to be honest. And I won't be doing it again. I was given about, I think, 6 weeks off. So I took unpaid leave for about 6 weeks. I used holiday leave. I was working pretty much every evening, every weekend, every holiday, any time I had, because there was an urgency to get this published. So if you bring out a book about something that's topical like this in 10 years' time, for sake of argument, in terms of an extreme length of time, nobody's interested in it. It's old news. We know that story. Who cares? So it had to be brought out quickly. And also at that point, we thought that the public inquiry would report much faster than ultimately turned out to be the case. So we thought that we would be coming out after the public inquiry. As it so happened, this preceded the public inquiry by more than 6 months. So there was a sense of really stampeding to try to get this done, but realizing that, yeah, it's a massive, you're talking about tens of thousands of pages of written evidence here to get through, interviews that I had to go and do with people. But it was a challenge, I'll not lie.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like I'm having a mild concern about when my book eventually gets released next year, because it had to be pushed back due to coronavirus and whatnot. So like my book on Brexit doesn't come out until February. But thankfully it is like a more of a warning about what happened looking forward. So hopefully it'll still be relevant.
Brexit will still be with us in many years, I think.
I think so, but maybe people will be sick of hearing it, but we'll see about that. So how has it felt working as political editor at like a traditionally unionist paper, whilst you mentioned in the book being accused of sectarianism by the DUP, and like finding that when you were reporting on the RHI scandal that you were selling out the newsletter in like traditionally Republican or nationalist areas? Like, is that a weird feeling? Did you get like a sense that you were potentially like abandoning your traditional like readership, or did you feel that those who pay for good journalism would go with you no matter where you went, as long as you were pursuing the truth?
I'm not sure if the DUP accused me of sectarianism. They certainly, some DUP people certainly accused me of bias and things like that. I'm not actually across the detail of what I've written myself in the book. It's a while since I wrote it, but certainly they were deeply unhappy about it. I mean, Arlene Foster threatened to sue, and lots of other people threatened to sue over it. So there was no mistaking their anger at that. I mean, I suppose when I became political editor at the newsletter, nobody said to me in the interview process, are you a Protestant or a Catholic? Are you a unionist or a nationalist or anything else? What party do you support? That was never, and never has been, anything to do with my job. The newsletter has a very clear editorial line in terms of its support for the union, its support for unionist parties at election time. That's a matter for the editor. My job is to report politics. It's to understand politics. It's to be able to explain to our readers what is going on in politics. My own views in that are, frankly, I think, or ought to be, irrelevant to my job. And so therefore, that never terribly concerned me. I think there was a decision by my editor which was very genuinely brave in all of this, in that he backed my coverage of this over years now, where it was clear that this was discomfiting some very senior people in the DUP. There are other editors of the newsletter who would not have done that, who would have said, this is a commercial disaster potentially. We're going to lose readers. At the time of the Good Friday Agreement, the newsletter backed the agreement in concert with the Irish News. There were joint editorials. There was a very clear decision way before my time, and nothing to do with me, that whatever you think of that decision, whether it was right or whether it was wrong, it was a very brave thing to do for a newspaper to do something that it knew was not chiming with a very significant section of its readership. And the newsletter lost thousands of readers over that decision. That is a massive commercial problem for a relatively small regional newspaper. And so therefore, you can do that a few times. You can't do that all the time, or you don't exist. And so therefore, it's very easy, I think, for people outside the industry to see this as an easy decision, as the obviously right thing to do. These things are much more complicated than that. But one of the amazing things about this is that we have had very little negative feedback from newsletter readers about our coverage of this. Overwhelmingly, from then until now, they accepted this was a massive scandal. This story needed to be told. and that the way we were telling it was not seeking to go out and bash the DUP. We covered this story from every angle. So when it now turns out, and I didn't know it at the time, but when it now turns out that John Robinson, a DUP SPAD, was leaking to me in a way which was unclear at the time. It was simply a brown envelope that landed on my desk, but leaking to me details that shifted the blame from the DUP to the civil service. We ran that on the front page the next day. We named those people the next week on the front page. We went every bit as big on those aspects of the story as we did then on the plight of some of the genuine claimants in this story, who are now left in an appalling position because of how they have been treated by this. So I think that anybody looking at this dispassionately and looking at how we've covered this was never simply a hatchet job to get Arlene Foster or to collapse Stormont or any of those things that some other people did use this for. I think we tried to cover this imperfectly, as will unquestionably be the case about all journalism, but we imperfectly tried to cover this as honestly as we could with the information that we had at each stage.
No, you mentioned there so perhaps like Arlene Foster and the DUP, didn't accuse you directly of sectarianism, but it's that they accused you of bias. Now, it's quite a commonly seen tactic in Northern Ireland. Generally, if you don't like what's going on, if politicians don't like what's going on, it's not uncommon to see them accuse the questioner or whoever is challenging them on anything of sectarianism. Like it's a pattern that like is concerning to me. I don't like that it being used as a political shield when something else would do. It feels like a very last resort and desperate kind of politics. But in a way, I kind of see it as part of like a wider trend in politics across the world. Like, for example, the Dominic Cummings thing that is like blowing up in the news at the minute. The idea is that the way that they respond to it is deflect, don't apologize, attack the other side. And it's a very like Trumpian tactic, but he in no way invented this tactic. He just uses it very well. Like, what do you make of that as a way of responding to political criticism? And like, do you see it as problematic, or is it just something that's always happened in politics?
It's clearly something which has always happened in politics. It's as old as the hills. I think that what we're seeing with people like Donald Trump in particular, and then others learning from him and seeing that, well, hang on a minute, it works for the president of the United States. Let's give it a go. What we're seeing with him is that he's taking it to new extremes. So he is taking an old tactic and he's realizing that you can push it much further than was the case in the past. So rather than some sort of subtle attempt or limited attempt to claim that a media outlet is biased against you and therefore that discredits what they're saying, he's just relentlessly savaging the entire media effectively, with the exception of Fox News, and so therefore that takes it on, I suppose, from where it used to be. But I mean, most political parties, there are very few political parties who, when it suits them, will not come after the questioner and say, actually, this might be something that gets us out of a hole that we're in. And yes, there are certain politicians and certain parties who take it to unpleasant levels, to extreme levels, to absurd levels. But I think that we should recognize that power, which is what politics is so powerful as a desire in those who seek it, that most people in those situations will justify to themselves that what they are doing, the end ultimately justifies the means. And so therefore, for them to retain power, that is a good thing, they see as self-evident to themselves. And so therefore, clinging on to that is justifiable. And some people will stop at certain points. Other people will not stop at any point.
Now, perhaps this is more imagined amongst the commentariat, but like, are we seeing like a degradation of the political conversation within our country as a result of this like more extreme type of rhetoric, or is this just like our own perceptions that things are getting worse?
No, I mean it's deeply alarming. I mean it's alarming to me as a journalist, as somebody who cares about truth, who believes that there is truth that we can find. Often it's hard to find. Often we can't ever be sure as to what the truth of something like RHI actually was. But we know that it is out there, and if we could get everybody to talk, if we could get all the documents, all the messages that didn't come up, we could actually tell a much clearer version of what happened. The sort of world which certainly somebody like Donald Trump, as the most extreme proponent of this form of politics, represents, is that it essentially sows in the minds of the reader, of the viewer, the idea that we simply can never know, and therefore everything is a fog of war, everything is misinformation, everything is so questionable as to we can never know what actually happened, who was right, who was wrong, and therefore the person who is wrong gets away in the smoke there. And that, to me, I think is deeply alarming. And I think that in the pandemic we see the an element of that form of politics getting its comeuppance, because suddenly we realize that truth does matter. People die, and people do not survive if lies actually have a real world impact. And that is perhaps the most extreme version of where this matters. But it matters in all sorts of other areas of life. The little guy loses out. Somebody corruptly manages to get away with something where they should not be able to do that, because there is no sense that that power can be held to account.
Is that sort of politics as conflict trope, is that more, do you think that's more prevalent in Northern Ireland because of our sort of history of conflict?
It is. And I mean, really, what we're seeing in many ways is the world now more resembling Northern Ireland politics. So it's a very tribalized world. So, for instance, over the Dominic Cummings thing, as you've suggested there, the real defense from a lot of conservatives who back Cummings, sort of Brexiteer types, hardline Brexiteers, is this is just a leftish plot to get our guy. And you can understand where they're coming from on that in many ways, but it's clearly absurd. I mean, you've got lots of people on the right. You've got Steve Baker, you've got the Daily Mail, you've got all sorts of people, Ian Dale, who are not in any way leftists, who have deep concerns about how he has behaved here. But once you reduce it to a simple tribal debate, then you simply look at yourself, I suppose, as a reader or as a viewer and think, well, which tribe am I? Right? This is the side I should be backing here. We know that's how politics in Northern Ireland has existed for a very long time. And one of the interesting things about RHI, and one of the things that got me interested in it at the outset, was that that suddenly wasn't how people were reacting to this. You had unionists who were every bit as angry as nationalists. And that doesn't happen very often. And that was one of the things that made it such a powerful story. And likewise with Dominic Cummings, I think you see flashes of that where, and that is the danger of this for politicians, that they fall back, I suppose, on the idea that because of tribalism they can get away with literally anything, and then suddenly they push it to a point where that no longer works, and that's dangerous for them.
Yeah, I think it's well, like, at this point I think Dominic Cummings ends up staying because they've doubled down and they can't afford to look weak. But I was really shocked actually to see Steve Baker as one of the people that came out and criticised him, given Baker's support for Brexit and Cummings' like integral role in the Brexit campaign. But anyway, to move on to something you actually touched on there in anonymous sources. You mentioned that throughout your RHI reporting, you were relying on certain like anonymous sources feeding you information or quotes. Um, do you see that as like how reliant do you believe like investigative reporting and journalism generally should be on the use of anonymous sources as the basis of stories or to corroborate evidence? Especially given like there was a real focus last year during the 2019 election campaign. I cannot remember who wrote the piece for Open Democracy, but there was a piece about the use of um, anonymous sources within Number 10 Downing Street as a way for Dominic Cummings to spread misinformation or control media narratives. Like how much do you think we should be depending on anonymous sources as journalists? And do you feel that their use, especially for like politicians within Number 10, like gives them this extra like avenue with which to let out like stories that they want to without actually having to like take the responsibility of having made that statement?
I think it really depends on the context of what's involved. So let's say, for sake of argument, there is an anonymous source within Downing Street who comes forward today to a journalist in London and says, I have information that shows that Dominic Cummings has been lying about what happened here. Should you run that story? Of course, you should run that story if you can stand up that what they're saying is correct. Maybe their job depends on them staying anonymous. Is that a reasonable thing to do? Of course, it's reasonable, I think. And so therefore, I think you really have to, you cannot divorce the principle from the context of what is involved here. I think if you look at it at two ends of a very wide spectrum, you could fill a newspaper every day with purely anonymous quotes from anonymous sources. I think overwhelmingly people would agree that's ludicrous and that's unhealthy. At the other end of the spectrum, you could have no anonymous quotes whatsoever. You could just run what people say on the record. And if they're not prepared to go on the record, you don't run it. I think that's deeply problematic. But even if you adopt that approach of a sort of purist, people must stand by what they say. What do you do when a rival outlet breaks a major story using an anonymous source? Do you just ignore it? Do you follow it up? Do you then say, well, here is what an anonymous source says. We've put this to so and so on the record and they won't comment on it. Then you get into this sort of moral quagmire as to whether you're simply leeching off the journalism of other people and regurgitating it, but taking a very high-minded approach to that. I think that there is a deep responsibility here on editors and on journalists to evaluate who is speaking to them. They know who the source is overwhelmingly. There are very few instances where you don't know who the source is. In this story, I've referred to the point where documents landed on my desk. Clearly, I didn't know who that was, but that's the exception rather than the rule. And so therefore, you have a chance as a journalist to evaluate who is this person? Are they credible? How senior are they? How much do they actually know about what's going on? And what might their motivations be? And so therefore you can test those things with the source, with other people, and you then can form a judgment as to what's relevant there. But there's also a very significant difference between anonymous sources briefing against other people, as happened during the election campaign, and that is, that is much less justifiable, I think, other than in extreme circumstances, and anonymous sources briefing against their own side or revealing information that is in the public interest, that is effectively a whistleblowing situation, I suppose, in the widest definition of that word. That, I think, overwhelmingly is justified, even if those people as whistleblowers or quasi whistleblowers have got complex reasons and maybe conflicting reasons as to why they're doing that. There's maybe internal turf wars. If you go all the way back to Watergate and you look at Deep Throat, there's all sorts of suggestions that, as I think a deputy director, a very senior position in the FBI, that individual had complex reasons as to why they were doing what they did. Was it in the public interest, even knowing that? Absolutely.
It's an odd one to get into, because like obviously you want to know who is like saying things, because sources are important, but at the same time it can provide like a fantastic anonymous way of like you said, blowing the whistle. How did
There's also just one other thing I should say, that as a journalist, I think you should always push to get as much of a clarification as to who the anonymous source is as possible. So a senior government source, a DUP source, a civil service source, you can try to, at least, even if you're not naming the person, get some context to the reader as to who this is, that gives them a clue as to what their motive might be, as to who they are. That's imperfect, but it's something, rather than simply a source told me. I think that's pretty poor.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Now, the use of anonymous sources is kind of leads on to my next question. In the book, you have numerous, like countless references to the trend of and culture of secrecy within Stormont, even like within department, within parties themselves, and especially within the executive between parties. Now, how dangerous is that prevent like trend of secrecy within government? Like surely that's horrifying for us. Like we want to be able to know what is going on, what discussions are being had, who is like making decisions on what, but at the same time, there's a great point that Hillary Clinton actually raised, No, we'll get onto her and her emails very briefly at some point, I'm sure, because it's sort of comparative to some of the email questions I want to ask you about. But Hillary Clinton spoke about how Abraham Lincoln said that there was no way he could have done some of the things he did as president without the ability to hold both public and private opinions and have discussions with cabinet ministers and advisors and other politicians off the record in a way where he could express his own private opinion and reason with people in ways that would not have been acceptable to voters, but were crucial to his legacy as a president. And one of the reasons he became one of the reasons he was able to make some of the decisions and like pass some of the laws that he was able to do were because of his ability to have opinions in private. Like, is there a line to walk there? Should we have like complete transparency, like in that film Circle with Emma Watson, where politicians start wearing videos, like a constant live stream of all the work they're doing, so everyone can see every meeting? Like where does the line lie on that issue, do you think?
Oh, I mean that quote from Lincoln is self-evidently correct. I think when it's being used by Hillary Clinton in that way, it's pretty self-serving, obviously because of what she had been up to. But I mean that should not cloud our judgment here. And the danger in any political issue is that you look at the individuals involved rather than the principles involved. Clearly, politicians need to be able to discuss with themselves, with their aides internally, and with others, very complex, very controversial, very sensitive issues, and that should not be transparent. And as a journalist, I want to see everything. Of course, I do, but I think that there is a healthy tension between a journalism which is pushing the boundaries to try to get to as much of that as possible, and a political system which rightly protects some of that as being important, and being protected. And we have got, I think, a very good balance in the UK in rough terms with the Freedom of Information Act, which allows for a safe space for politicians to debate policy that is exempt from release. It has all sorts of exemptions for national security, for commercial interests, for junior officials, and privacy reasons. There are lots of good principles there, but it also recognizes the overwhelming public good of having transparency, and that the starting point should be that this should be transparent unless there is a good reason to withhold it. I think that is healthy. We've also then got a historic mechanism through the release of declassified government records after now 20 years. It used to be 40 years, then 30 years, now it's 20 years, which recognizes that much more candid stuff which would not be appropriate to be released at the time should subsequently be released for two reasons. First of all, it helps us to understand how the system works and to better understand it, to make it better. And secondly, it helps us to, I suppose, put into context something which no longer is sensitive, no longer relates to people who in many cases are even alive or active in politics, but which helps us to understand why they did what they did, and we can learn from that. And it's a historical aspect. But when it comes to this story of RHI, if you think about RHI like a body, I think that the secrecy inherent in how Stormont operated is a bit like the circulation system. It's absolutely critical to enabling this scandal to happen. Without the secrecy, without the indefensible secrecy and the rule-breaking secrecy and law-breaking secrecy in some instances, I think arguably, you have got no real ability to do what happened here. And that, I think, gives the lie to the idea that secrecy makes government better, that having a safe space which completely shuts politicians off from being accountable for what they do is actually in the public interest. Suddenly, you've got Andrew Crawford in the background, working very closely with people in Moy Park. He's arguing for their interests. Those are not necessarily in the public interest. And that ultimately ends up costing taxpayers hundreds of millions of pounds. That's not healthy.
How much of a problem does technology make this? Like, we've got so many more ways of just having conversations that can disappear. Like, you could, like, WhatsApp allows complete encryption. You can have, I don't know how many different email accounts. Like, there's a couple of different politicians actually that you mentioned, and like cases in the book where DUP SPADs or MLAs have been using personal Hotmail accounts, like, for example, or on the other side of the aisle, Marcin O'Miller uses his own, I think it's New Belfast, like, website email address for all of his official communication, or most of it. how much harder does that make like your job in attempting to piece together just pieces of evidence from emails or things that you can request when there's 100 new avenues where you don't know if they exist, you've no access to them, you've no idea like where to go searching because there's so many different like pieces of technology you can use for secretive communication. And how much more difficult does that make scrutiny of government as well?
It's a really profound problem which governments and societies, rather, I suppose, across most of the Western world are grappling with at the moment. How does the principle of freedom of information, which is pretty widely accepted now across most democratic societies, how does that exist in an age where the old government filing cabinets that when this law came in, where what we were talking about, it was getting access to what was in the minister's case notes, in the minister's files, in memos from civil servants, etc. How does that operate in a situation where you can have a parallel system that never enters those files, that the government as an entity never gets access to the most sensitive aspects of what a minister or an advisor or even potentially a civil servant is up to? That is a really difficult area. And I think that one of the debates in Stormont at the moment, as a consequence of RHI, is a bill, a private member's bill from the TUV leader, Jim Allister, who's very much an opponent of the entire Stormont system. So we know where he's coming from with this. But I think that he is seeking to try to address this through the route of criminalizing effectively people who deliberately try to hide their government business in these private channels. Now, whether that is the proportionate or the correct way to deal with this is not for me as a journalist to say, but I think that it throws up a lot of really fundamental issues with this, because if you do not have some sort of strong sanction for somebody keeping things off the government system, whether they're inappropriate or just embarrassing or whatever it might be, why should anyone ever use the government system? Why not simply be your own arbiter as to whether any of this should ever be released historically or contemporaneously through freedom of information? So I think that is one of the most significant issues that we have at the moment. What is government and who actually controls information?
Now you would think that the sanctions would help, but uh, it's like Hillary Clinton should be in jail and she's not because of just who she is, and that's kind of a trend that I also see in Northern Irish politics, in UK politics, like there seems to be like a lack in my mind anyway of accountability and responsibility for things that in any normal job by any standard would just sink your career. Like you'd be done. Like there's I remember watching a former CIA agent on Joe Rogan's podcast just talking about the emails, and he just said, you know, if she wasn't Hillary Clinton, she would be in jail. That like she broke the law, and I'm concerned that even those sanctions and just like sheer incompetency doesn't seem to lead to electoral consequences or real world consequences a lot of the time. Like it's a trend we see in Northern Ireland more specific, like pretty specifically as well, and one that we're used to seeing. You mentioned in the book about how it seemed to have cost the DUP in the assembly elections in 2017, and yet all of a sudden, like 6 weeks later, they're returning 10 MPs and the unionist vote holds up. Now they've wasted, obviously part of the book is explaining that the £500 million figure is very dependent on what they choose to do. But like Arlene Foster has potentially wasted £500 million and she's still leader. I don't understand how that squares, and like, where do you see that trend going? Or like, do you think I'm overreacting? Like maybe I am.
Well, I think to understand that, you have to understand the mind of any typical voter, and we're all voters, so we all to a certain extent grapple with this ourselves when it comes to election time. There are some people who simply go into the ballot box and vote whatever way they vote, regardless of what has happened. They vote Conservative, they vote Labour, they vote DUP, they vote Sinn Féin, whatever it is, and they are essentially tribal loyalists who are so deeply committed to their side, that they believe they are right regardless of what they do. But most people aren't like that. Most people have got at least some potential to move, at least in a Northern Ireland context, within their tribe, if you like. So within unionism, they might move from one unionist party to another. Within nationalism, from the SDLP to Sinn Féin, or vice versa, or from the Conservative Party to the Brexit Party or UKIP or whatever it might be. And so therefore, for those people, I think we should always be mindful of the level of care that a lot of voters put into how they decide how to cast their ballot. They are weighing up the individual attributes of a candidate. They're weighing up the policies of a party. They're weighing up who the opponent is. They're weighing up local issues in their area, whether their local representative of the party they support might be corrupt or might be an imbecile or whatever it might be, but they actually like the party. They are weighing up all of these factors, and they're trying to decide which comes out on top, which is most important in these circumstances that we now face. And so, for instance, if you're a Brexiteer and you're voting in the last general election, and you think the predominant issue in this is Brexit, you might set aside all sorts of concerns about a party leader, about a candidate, because you believe that is the most important issue. And likewise, if you're a Remainer, you might do exactly the same thing on the other side. To some people, that might seem absurd. They might say, why are you voting for somebody who you maybe believe is corrupt, or you believe is a megalomaniac, or whatever it might be? But there's a certain logic to that individual. And so therefore, I think it should rarely be the job of journalists, very rarely, and I certainly don't think it should ever be my job, to tell voters how to vote. It should be about giving them the information to make that choice. And without that information, they can't make a meaningful choice. So therefore, if we hadn't known about RHI in 2017, people would not even have had that as a factor in their thinking. But I think we should recognize that it's not the only thing that's important to people, and we should respect it. In a democracy, that's for the voter to decide.
There is certainly a case to which we have been more used to single issue politics and single issue based voting in Northern Ireland comparative to say the rest of the UK. Do you see a point in the future where that isn't the defining question of our politics? Like, do you see a moment where an election could be fought without mentioning? Okay, maybe not without mentioning. That's almost impossible, I would say. But like without the main issue or one of the key issues being our constitutional question. Do you think we have to settle that before we get to that point?
It's incredibly difficult to see how we get to that point, to be honest. In 1998, at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, people were very idealistic about this. People thought we've ended the Troubles, we've taken the gun out of politics, we've stopped the bombings. The natural consequence of that is that as we get local responsibility for public services, that's where things are going to move. And certainly when I started as a journalist in 2006, very much the message to me as a young reporter on the journalism course when I was starting off at the Belfast Telegraph was that overwhelmingly you're going to be reporting not on constitutional politics, you're going to be reporting on hospitals, on schools, on roads, on bread and butter politics. That's where we're moving towards. Stormont has responsibility for these things, or at that point Stormont was down, but we were moving towards Stormont coming back, and that is what the public are going to care about. And for a while, that was partially true. It was never overwhelmingly true, but for a while, that was at least in the mix. And one of the, I think, concerning things over the last 4 years, three and a half years, let's say, since Brexit and since RHI, is that we have moved in the other direction in Northern Ireland. We're moving towards a more tribalised landscape. And yet, in a paradox, we have got a growth of the Alliance Party at the same time as the growth of that tribalism, or the entrenchment of that tribalism. And we've got the growth of parties like the Green Party, People Before Profit, and parties that are at least not defined by their stance on the constitutional issue. And so therefore, there is at least the potential that those parties become so dominant, or so influential, if not so dominant, that they really move the political debate onto different territory. But I think it's just impossible to see. And one of the really interesting things in 2017 to me as a journalist was that there had been this idea that younger people cared less about tribal politics, about constitutional politics, about orange and green. And largely, I think that's correct. Young people have grown up in a different context. They have more friends across the divide. There is more intermarriage. There's All of these things are true. And yet, one of the things that was really interesting to see in all sorts of anecdotes and in some surveys was that in 2017, young people tended to revert to their parents' view of politics. So they maybe didn't feel it as keenly. It was less deeply embedded within their psyche. But when there was a big moment of tribal debate, albeit it was over a green energy scheme, it was over Brexit, it was over things that maybe perhaps ought not to have been tribal, but there was this big debate between Sinn Féin and the DUP, and it was a very tribal election. We had the infamous quote from Arlene Foster about crocodiles in the Irish language. I think she very consciously, to my mind, moved that election onto orange and green territory because she couldn't fight it on her record in government, because her record in government had been so appalling based on the RHI scandal. But when it moved onto that territory, I think when you scratched the surface, you saw that a lot of people instinctively, at some level, even if they didn't want to be there, saw themselves shifting back to their side. And that, I think, is quite depressing.
I was hoping for a more positive answer, Sam. I don't.
Sorry, I'm a journalist.
Yeah, it's honestly a really interesting point for me though. That do you think that that drift back towards tribal politics was driven just by the high turnout in more staunchly unionist or nationalist areas, or and sort of seen to dissipate, say, the SDLP vote and the UUP vote? Do you think that's more like a losing voters who would have been more moderate and re-energizing those who are more extreme, or do you think it's an actual shift because there's because we've only got, even though we have a turnout higher than the rest of the UK sort of generally on average, we're still missing 30 to 35 or more % of the eligible population who vote to come out and vote. So that kind of unknown, do you see that as being people who have become apathetic to politics and previously had voted for more moderate union or nationalist parties, or do you see that as just a shift from those groups?
I think it's very difficult to work out who the non-voters actually support. I mean, there has sort of been a received wisdom in Northern Ireland for a long time that these people are much more moderate, that they're turned off by tribal politics, that they don't come out because of that. In some cases, clearly that will be true. I think there's also evidence even in things like the flag protest, for instance, where you see some people who are turned off politics, who maybe do not vote or maybe say they don't vote, but they're not in any way moderates. We see that, somebody like Jimmy Bryson came out of the flag protest. He's young. He has grown up overwhelmingly after the Troubles. It doesn't mean that he's an Alliance supporter. And so therefore, I think there is a danger in extrapolating too much out of individual cases there. And would something like the Australian compulsory voting system lead to a better reflection of public opinion? Clearly it would, because you would have a higher buy-in from the public in that, and that would be positive. But it's very difficult, I think, to know where that would actually go.
One of the big parts of the book is your use of the phrase actually on the front cover, the inside story of Cash for Ash scandal and Northern Ireland's secretive new elite. Now, you mentioned that Northern Ireland has more special advisors than twice as many as the Welsh government, more than the Scottish government, and more than the Republic of Ireland, I think it was.
You're testing my knowledge now of what I wrote, but it's something like that. Yeah. It's certainly a lot.
You see, I'm lucky. I only finished it yesterday, so you see, I've got it fresh in my mind. But this growth of special advisors, where did that come from, and how dangerous are special advisors? Because you acknowledge very, very openly that you can go back to Blair and you have Alistair Campbell, you go back to Margaret Thatcher and she had advisors, and you can, as long as politicians have really been around, they're always going to have someone to bounce ideas off who's more knowledgeable in certain aspects than they are, who is the meat and gristle behind, the big flashy front that is the charismatic, winning politician with their smile and their witty remarks. How did we end up with such a huge portion of our government being run by special advisors, and how dangerous is that?
Well, politicians have always had advisors. The special bit of it really relates to who pays for them. So the special advisor is somebody who is paid for by the taxpayer, and that fundamentally shifts things. So they are there as a temporary civil servant. They're brought into the department, so it's not somebody who is back at party headquarters who the minister phones and gets advice for, passes papers to. This is somebody who is recognised as not being non-partisan in the way that a civil servant is meant to be, but with the exception of that aspect of their role, they are a temporary senior civil servant. And so therefore, they are meant to be more accountable. They're being paid for by the public, and therefore the public has a right to know certain things about them. And I think critically, when you come to the Northern Ireland context, you see a growth of these people, both in terms of their number and in terms of their power, and allied to that, their salaries. And we know that within an organization, generally you can work out who the most powerful person is by looking at who's the most handsomely handsomely paid. And when you look at the situation in Stormont, you've got SPADs who are being paid more than some ministers. Now, I think that rather gives away where power lies. When the minister is getting £80,000 a year and the SPAD is getting £92,000 a year, there is a very significant and I think unhealthy shift in terms of the balance of power and accountability within the department. And the central element of this is not that SPADs are a bad thing in themselves. A SPAD is simply somebody who is there to be the minister's eyes and ears within the department. Actually, that can be quite a healthy thing. That can remind civil servants, who can be very wily creatures, who can run rings around a minister, who can try to undermine the mandate, maybe quite radical mandate that a minister, maybe a Sinn Féin minister has for something like the 11 plus, maybe a DUP minister has a very radical agenda on the issues that are in their manifesto that have been endorsed by the public. And the civil service could potentially unravel that. And that's not healthy. That's not democratic. And so therefore the SPAD is meant to be there to help the minister push through their mandated agenda from the public. The difficulty here is twofold. So first of all, those people are unaccountable. So whereas the minister is paid for by the public, he's accountable to the public at the ballot box, and he's accountable to the public in the assembly, before assembly committees and before the chamber as a whole. And he takes questions, and we see that in public. The SPAD's nowhere. He's in the shadows, and that is the difficulty where if we don't know that this individual is doing certain things, how can we hold them to account? How can we actually hold power to account? And the second element of this is that the balance, I suppose, within the system. So the SPAD is not actually, in many cases here, doing what on paper they are paid to do by taxpayers. By taxpayers, they are paid to look after the interests of the minister's policy within the department. So they are there to help with the running of public services, with bringing forward legislation, with dealing with queries that are coming to the minister's private office. That is all basically matters which are in the wider public interest, or are judged by the government system to be in the public interest. What we actually see is that special advisors are running political parties. So Timothy Johnston is de facto chief executive of the DUP. He is deciding on the design of election posters. He is deciding on the manifesto. He is deciding on staff leave in party headquarters. Now, why should taxpayers fund a political party's chief executive to give them a political advantage over their rivals? Their rivals have to fundraise to pay for their chief executives or their equivalent people who run their political structures. And therefore, that is something which I think is indefensible, but that is being hidden from the public. And it's only able to be hidden from the public because that special advisor is using private email systems, private phones, private means of communication, which hide that from the public who pay his salary.
Has there been any legislative move or suggestions of reducing the amount of special advisors in Stormont, especially for the DUP and Sinn Féin, or at least ones that are paid for by the taxpayer?
There is a modest move towards that, again, in this bill from Jim Allister, which is before the Assembly. He is looking to cut the number of special advisors in Stormont Castle, which is really the Stormont's equivalent of the Cabinet Office, the sort of seat of devolved power. At the moment, the DUP and Sinn Féin can have 8 special advisors between them in that department alone, and then 1 each in every other department for each of the other ministers from whichever party they come from. it's really difficult to defend why you need 8 in there. I mean, I think that is really absurd, and I think it was partly because they had so many in Stormont Castle that somebody like Timothy Johnston, some of the other special advisors, were able to basically moonlight as party managers because there just wasn't enough work for them within the system. If they had been overworked in that setting, they would not have been able to decide that this is the wrong color for election posters and be giving advice to the designer as to how to improve his work. And so therefore that, I suppose, gives the lie to the idea that somehow these guys were absolutely critical and we need to have 4 each within that setting.
Now, there's a real point that I wanted to raise. Actually, now you can correct me if I've misunderstood exactly how this works, but one of the biggest revelations that you kind of bring forward in the book, one that I wasn't expecting, sort of like an avenue that I wasn't expecting you to go down, was the idea that, the fact that Moy Park is owned by a large Brazilian conglomerate, led by JBS, I believe the name of the company is. And so essentially the profit from Moy Park is flowing, like our largest poultry production company, processor, that's the word I'm looking for. All the profits are just like pouring straight out the country. And then RHI essentially allowed Moy Park, now, like I said, correct me if at any point I get this wrong, allowed Moy Park to reduce the amount that they were paying to farmers to look after poultry, because they were like hoping that they would make up the drop in subsidies to them in the RHI payments that they were getting from the government. So the subsidy that, like, so as you quite rightly point out, this is almost like a direct subsidy to Moy Park. But the point that really gets me is that, I don't know, in my mind, and I'm sure in lots of other people's minds, okay, RHI was a massive fuck up. They've overspent massively. They are just like it's horrendous. Like I can't ever quite like explain my outrage for it. It's such a waste of money. But at the same time, I kind of have this weird notion that, at least the money is going to Northern Irish farmers and like staying in the country. Like, okay, we flooded this like industry with like way too much money, and we've betrayed a whole bunch of people on boilers, and like we've been like tearing the ass out of it basically. And yet, okay, the money's still in the Northern Irish economy. But this, just like that revelation in the book, was really shocking, in that like huge amounts of the money that was paid out through RHI just poured straight out of the country.
I mean, for me, this is the crux of the story, and it's also one of the most interesting aspects of the story, because it's got far wider implications for our entire economic system, how our politics and commercial worlds interact with each other. And so the sort of justification that you might get from the Ulster nationalism of the DUP or from the Irish nationalism of Sinn Féin is that, yeah, you know what, there's all sorts of problems with this, but as you say, it's ultimately good for Northern Ireland. It's good for the local economy. It comes in here, it circulates around, and therefore it's money we otherwise wouldn't have had. And that is at the heart of why some people saw this as a good thing, even after the scheme was out of control, because we're just shipping money across from London to Belfast, and that's great. And that in itself is a good policy, regardless of how it's being spent. But actually, as you've said, what we're actually doing is shipping it or air freighting it from the Treasury in London to Belfast, and then sticking it on a plane and sticking it to America. And from there it goes to the parent company, which is in Brazil. And so I think one of the central issues here is that there didn't seem to be any distinction in the minds of senior DUP figures or senior civil servants as to whether what is good for Moy Park, as the biggest private sector employer in Northern Ireland, this real beast of the poultry industry in Europe, actually. I mean, it's a massive player in the global industry. Whether what was good for it was good for Northern Ireland, those two things were synonymous. So naturally, if Moy Park benefit from that, that is good for Northern Ireland, they thought. And actually, some of the losers out of this were Moy Park's farmers, not just because the scheme has now been retrospectively cut, but actually, even at the time, the money was going into their bank account. It looked like they were getting rich in this. They faced a lot of public anger because of that. What the public didn't understand, because of this secretive and highly complex pricing structure that Moy Park had, was that over time, according to the evidence of Moy Park's farmers, that gradually accrued to Moy Park, and the benefit to the farmer diminished and diminished and diminished to the point that they saw no benefit whatsoever from this. And I think that there are really profound questions here, because if the government preferentially treat, and it's clear in this story that civil servants give information to this company before it even went to their minister. So if they give that level of preferential treatment to a company, and use sort of the end justifies the means philosophy here, that it's good for Northern Ireland because we really get some sort of economic benefit from this. How does that ultimately work out in a capitalist system? In a capitalist system, the strong are meant to survive and the weak are meant to fail. And in this system, the government is artificially propping up a company that is driving out of business other companies within the sector. They can't compete. Moy Park gets bigger and bigger and bigger. As it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it dominates to an extent that the government has no choice, it seems, but to continue to play ball with this company, or they will simply take their ball and go and set up shop across the border, or in England, or in France, or wherever else they have operations. And so therefore, it becomes more and more difficult for this spiral effect to be broken. And you get these behemoths of industry that are so big that they are simply too big to fail. And in a small private sector economy in Northern Ireland, the government is so in thrall to these businesses that it seems that really they, even after RHI becomes a scandal, they are still having these private meetings with Moy Park. Moy Park are leaning on them saying, can you reopen this scheme? And we see the minister then writing to London saying, Whitehall, can you help us out? Can we get this reopened?
It's a really dangerous story in my mind of the power of international capital and finance to just almost dictate to governments. Like I never quite imagined that we'd be discussing something like that in Northern Ireland, like in a really Northern Ireland specific way. So, like, I always imagined the tendrils of like international capital influencing the way a government makes their decisions was like an issue that we wouldn't see in Northern Ireland. Like I never saw that as something that we would be focusing on. Like I thought, okay, our economy and our little farming industry is far too tiny and unimportant when you have countries on the scale of India and China, Britain, Germany, America, with huge economies and massive GDPs. Like, why is it scary to you that we're now looking at the exploitation potentially of the Northern Irish economy from like large unaccountable multinationals?
Well, let me answer that in what might seem like a bizarre way, but I think that it's a positive that we're talking about this. So I think one of the positives of this story is that these issues that heretofore we didn't even think about in some cases, and probably if I had gone into my editor in 2015 and said I've got this story about this issue, he wouldn't have thought that the public were that massively interested in it. And suddenly, not only do we see that these stories exist and they can be reported, but we realize that a lot of the public do care about this and they're interested in this and they're angry about this and they want to know more. And so that is a positive of this, that whereas before this, I suppose tribal politics obscured this. So you simply throw up an argument about a flag and forget about all this other stuff. People won't really respond to that in a political sense. Suddenly that's not true anymore. And people do care about this and they're angry about this. And it doesn't mean that it's the only thing, of course, that they're going to consider when they go to vote, but it might be one of the issues that they consider. And therefore that I think is a positive, that we're actually able to pull back the curtain a bit. This has been going on. This has been going on for a very long time. And one of the, as a side note to this, I was going through some of the declassified government files from the early 1990s, I think they were from, where and I was doing this about 6 months ago at the Public Record Office, and there were in those files applications from Moy Park as a much smaller company at that point, but a pretty ruthless, a pretty aggressive expansionist company trying to get as big as possible, as is its right within a capitalist system, trying to make as much money as possible. They were trying to get money out of government for subsidies. There were concerns among officials as to the role of government in this. They were playing one part of government off against another, trying to locate their businesses. This was during the height of the Troubles. This was during a point where getting employment anywhere was a massive public good, because it might get people away from what might drag them into violence and might drag them into poverty and all sorts of other issues. And yet, even in that context, officials seemed to me to demonstrate more skepticism about what was going on than the officials in 25 years' time, where actually they're much more acquiescent. They're much more, almost, there is an element of clientelism in this, where they are really agents almost for Moy Park. I mean, they are there to help and assist and do what Moy Park needs. And there's much less questioning within the system, even behind closed doors, even privately in these files that we see now, of what actually, of where the public good and the public interest lies in all of this.
Do you foresee a world in which it's possible that we don't see governments buying to large companies like this in a way that, like for example, in America, you've seen the hysteria amongst different cities as to whether Amazon are going to put a factory there or warehouse, and governments repeatedly, or for example, like a closer to home example would be down south, where the Irish government are terrified to make any moves that might upset businesses happy with their incredibly low and like hands-off tax regime. Do you see like a way forward in politics where we can attempt to cut that, like, not desire to, but that like feeling that we need to look after like large businesses because of what they're giving us, even at the expense of smaller businesses who could like ultimately provide more jobs and more tax revenue?
I think we have to recognize that from time immemorial, if you can bring a company and you can bring a business to an area, that's going to be welcomed by that area. Generally, unless they're poisoning the river or something like that, which is clearly harming the area. If they are seen to be a fairly benign force within the area and they're bringing in investment, even in the case of Moy Park, while lots of the profit, overwhelmingly the profit, was being shipped out of Northern Ireland, they were employing people. They employ something like 6,000 people in Northern Ireland. They employ tradesmen who come and fix their machines. Those people rent houses in the area. Lots of that money does circulate in the area, so there is an economic benefit. And so, therefore, I think there is this tension between that desire locally to do what is good for the local area and what is good for wider society, whether that's in a regional sense, in a national sense, or in a global sense. And so, therefore, that's where I think global structures or wider either national or extra-national structures such as the European Union, such as world bodies, are able to bring some sort of wider perspective in this. There are lots of aspects of something like the EU that are clearly negative, that are bad. Whatever side we sit on in the debate about Brexit, clearly aspects of the EU are preposterous, and yet that is something where I think it has the potential, at least, to play a positive role, where you've got these big tech companies and they're able to actually say, we have the clout to stand up to you. We're big enough to be able to take you on your own terms, and say to Amazon, your practices here, for instance, are not in the interests even of the capitalist system that you purport to represent. I think that's important. And the danger in that, I suppose, is that if you don't have those structures, or we're able to get around those structures, if we accept that we live in a capitalist society and we're trying to make it as fair as possible, how does that even function if we don't even have a proper capitalist system where there is that tension between different companies competing on a level playing field? If the system is rigged and actually one company is so big that it can never fail, how does anybody compete with them?
Well, I guess that's the ultimate point of the game Monopoly. Anyway, I was amused to find out when I don't know, a couple of years ago, that Monopoly was actually invented to show people the problems of people having a monopoly on things and the problem with capitalism, which made me laugh. That's like the
It certainly does that.
Yeah. So just the last few quick fire questions for you. Have the DUP and Sinn Féin weathered this storm? Is there a sting in the tail?
Certainly in the short term, they're all back in there. They are trying to present a united front in terms of fighting the virus, and that obviously is a positive thing and something that we all want to see. But I think that there are massive questions as to whether that is, I suppose, papering over the reality of the distrust between those two parties and whether they actually have reformed their ways. I really am pretty skeptical yet as to whether they have changed what is going on in there. Some of the individual personnel have changed in terms of the SPADs, but I think that as journalists, we should never be cynical. We should never simply assume that something is going to be negative and going to be bad and not look at the evidence. But I think we should always be skeptical. We should always be looking at this with an eye to whether it actually has changed. And so far, I'm not convinced.
Are there any major changes you would make to the storming system? What do you feel about the idea of a citizens' assembly?
Well, I think that citizens' assemblies are interesting ideas, but I think that I think that we should recognize that they contain within them their own difficulties, and very often a solution to anything has its own problems, and we need to think about that at the point where we're setting it up. So, in the south, there were suggestions that the way in which these people were selected was imperfect at points, and that was covered up. It would seem, or certainly wasn't entirely transparent. So if you're giving power to a group of select citizens, it's absolutely critical that the way those people are selected is completely fair and absent of any bias. Otherwise, the entire system is pointless and is rigged. So I think that anything that takes away the power of representative democracy or direct democracy, where people individually and as an entire population can influence government, has to be looked at really carefully because it's open to significant abuse. One simple thing that would change things in Stormont is to shift more power from the executive to the legislature. And in Stormont, very often what we got was a situation where, and actually there was almost a Freudian way in which people in the Stormont executive would simply refer interchangeably to the assembly and the executive as though they were the same thing. One is meant to scrutinize the other, one is meant to hold in check the other. Now, how meaningful can that ever be where you don't have an opposition, where you've got, more than 95% of the MLAs are in government parties? But I think that within those very difficult parameters of our system, you need to have a situation where ministers fear the assembly, where they are hauled before the assembly to answer urgent questions about issues that arise. There was very often not really much sense of that in the old Stormont. I'm not massively convinced that that has changed, particularly without an opposition. And I think that we have regressed there, actually, where at the point where RHI happened and Stormont fell, we had more scrutiny of the executive within the legislature than we do now.
Okay, final question. What are you reading right now?
Oh, goodness. Well, I was just reading my own book, I have to say, for the audiobook version, but that's not very exciting. And that sounds either dull or incestuous that I'm reading my own stuff.
Oh no, I
I
totally get it. Like, yeah, I need to go back and reread my book to remember what I said.
Well, I was reading on a much more enjoyable note and something that I can recommend enthusiastically. I was reading Monty Don's Down to Earth, which I got for Christmas, and I've only got around to reading now in lockdown. I am also reading oh goodness me, what is it called? John Humphrey's book. I've just started it, which I got for Christmas, about his memoir, really. And I am reading one of David McKittrick's old books, the former Ireland correspondent for the Independent newspaper in London. It's a very old book that I managed to get over the internet. So it's a collection of his columns from the 1990s.
Oh, that's very cool. But so that's us. Thank you very much. Was a real pleasure. Is there anything you want to plug before we finish up? Aside from obviously people go buy Burned, it's fantastic.
No, all I would say is think about the media at this point. Not I'll not plug my own outlet above others. Whatever your political views, wherever you live regionally, wherever you live globally. This is a really difficult time for the media. Our sales have collapsed because of lockdown. Advertising has collapsed. The media is imperfect. We get things wrong. But I think that we do more good than we do harm. And without scrutiny of government, without scrutiny of power, whether economic or political, we're in a much worse place.
if you ever think your journalism that you're receiving is bad, always think it could be worse. It could be CNN. And
I'll not say anything about that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe to our mailing list or to this podcast itself, or you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. Our next episode out on Friday will be with Matthew Thompson, the host of Best of Belfast. And don't forget to use the code chatter at Podcasters Emporium to get 25% discount on anything. Until next time, thanks for listening.